Good afternoon, and welcome to our January edition of Lunch with the Libraries. We are happy that so many people are joining us today to learn more about the incredible history of the book and its author, What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, and the ongoing work of the conservation staff to ensure that Abby Fisher's legacy will continue to inspire researchers and cooks alike. I'm Erin Jakowski, Senior Associate Director of Lifelong Learning with the Office of Alumni Relations at Johns Hopkins University. This series is made possible through partnerships with the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums, the Friends of Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and the Office of Alumni Relations Lifelong Learning. Following the presentation, I encourage you to ask questions of our librarians and conservation staff in the Zoom Q&A. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. It is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Claire Miller, President of Friends of the Libraries.
Thank you very much, Erin, and welcome to all of you. The Friends of the Libraries of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries are delighted to welcome you and equally delighted to partner with Johns Hopkins University's Office of Alumni Relations, Lifelong Learning. The Friends of the Library were formed in 1941 and are one of the oldest library support groups in the country. Organizing events like Lunch with the Libraries that you're about to participate in fits with our mission of financial support and advocacy. We would love for any and all of you to join us in our efforts. We are all in for a really great treat today, cookbooks. I love to cook, and who doesn't? Except there are people who don't, but anyway. Let me now introduce you to our today's speaker, Heidi Herr. Heidi is the engagement librarian for the Winston Tabb Special Collections Research Center. Basically, what she does is liaison between the students and their needs of the libraries. She creates programs and activities to engage Johns Hopkins University students who conduct research using material that are primary sources. She's also the librarian for the English, philosophy, and writing seminars. She also oversees the Freshman Fellows Program, which is a remarkable thing for all the students who are in their freshman year. She has an MA in English and Library Science from the University of Maryland, College Park. Heidi, thank you for being here and thank you for all you do.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me share my screen with you and we'll get started. So I am so happy to talk to you today about the history of What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking. As you can see from this close-up of our copy, our book is indeed in rough shape. In fact, the images that I'm using in this presentation were all taken prior to the book's treatment in conservation. Oh, pardon me. While its initial condition may surprise you, I must admit that I'm one of those sentimentalists who loves seeing a cookbook splattered with grease stains, water damage, you name it, because it shows that the book was loved and well used. Whoever the original owners were, the cookbook made its way repeatedly to the kitchen, showing that Mrs. Fisher's recipes were easy to follow and made for a delicious cuisine. But cookbooks, of course, are far more than collections of recipes. As someone who has expanded our historic cookbook collection at Hopkins, I am constantly in amazement over what a collection of recipes can tell us about history and popular culture. It's rather like a Russian nesting doll in a sense. You look at one thing only to be taken away into a much smaller world that you then embody, and so on. You just keep on inhabiting all these different identities and worlds. For instance, a perusal of our Chinese cookbooks written for an American audience brings up questions about immigrant foodways and Frisian cuisine. Or you realize that Jell-O isn't just for bizarre salads at church functions, but the reason why we still know about it today is because it was an advertising juggernaut in the early 20th century, by inventing the Jell-O girl, she who must be obeyed. And how? Seriously, stay away from the Jell-O girl. She is trouble. She will make you exercise before eating Jell-O. Really, there are exercises in these pamphlets. But nonetheless, as ridiculous as the Jell-O girl is to our sensibilities today, it created a sense of brand loyalty and brand identity. Or you realize that a cookbook can be a form of stealth activism, like the women's suffrage cookbooks popular around the time when Abby Fisher was a celebrated cook and business owner in San Francisco. And I had similar thoughts when looking at the world of Abby Fisher while researching her cookbook. After all, it isn't just a collection of lovely recipes. It's a story of resilience and success after likely enslavement, of migration, of culinary skill mixed with social savvy. So let's break down the Russian nesting doll of what Mrs. Fisher knows about old Southern cooking. So of course it is important to note that this cookbook was not rediscovered until 1984. It was found at auction. And there had been whispers about this thing having existed, but no one really saw it from probably the late 19th century until 1984. And as a result, a lot of information about her has shifted to the years as more and more documents have come to light. So today we're fortunate in that we have a better understanding of who she is and the life that she led. And I think we can say with some confidence the following things about her. She was born in South Carolina. Her mother was an enslaved woman named Abby Clifton, and Abby Fisher took on both her mother's first and last name. Her father, her biological father, was an enslaver and farmer named James Andrews. We also know that Abby, at some point in the 1850s, met a man named Alexander Fisher. He was a minister. They fell in love, got married, moved to Alabama together, and had at least 11 children. We also know that at some point in the 1870s, she and her husband and entire family left the South and started a new life in San Francisco, where she became an award-winning cook and businesswoman. We also know that her cookbook was published in 1881. We know that it was transcribed by a group of wealthy San Francisco people. We know that the book was printed by a woman-owned collective, and we know that the book cost $1.50, which would be roughly $40 today. And the price was in keeping with the cost of cookbooks back in the 1880s. We also know, based on some promos, that it was very likely that the cookbook sold quite well. And it is also believed that one of the reasons why her cookbook remained unknown for so long until 1984 was because of the devastation wrought by the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. It's believed that a lot of surviving stock of her cookbook was destroyed due to that natural disaster. So clearly there are many things that are amazing about Mrs. Fisher's life, but one remarkable thing is that we can trace her life through census records. Here's a page from an 1870 census for Alabama. It lists the names and ages and occupations of members of the Fisher family. So here we have Alexander Fisher. We see that in 1870, he was 37 years old. And we see that his occupation is listed as a minister. And here we see Abby, and she's going by Abba here in the census form. We see that she's 35 and that her profession is keeping house. We also see that she, her husband, and all of the children listed here all are described as being mulattoes. So we can glean a lot of information from this one treasured document, including the place of birth for the Fisher family. So we see that Alexander Fisher was born in Alabama, and that Abba was born in South Carolina. Then we can look through census records and jump ahead another 10 years. And here we find one Abby Fisher listed as a business owner in San Francisco, working 10 hours a day with a starting capital of $500. So here, right here, Mrs. Abby Fisher, pickles and preserves, $500, owner operated. She is the sole employee listed and she works about 10 hours a day. Now, we currently do not know why the Fisher family embarked on such a huge cross-country move, but whatever happened in the 1870s proved crucial for the establishment of her successful business and the Fisher family's ability to use their skills to achieve social mobility. So now let's jump ahead another year to 1881, the year when Mrs. Fisher's cookbook was published. What strikes me here is the cover. And again, our cover is in bad shape, but if you see here, there's stamping here. We have a little like a lantern effect, and it says what Mrs. Fisher knows about old Southern cooking right here. What strikes me is that the cover with the gilt stamping emphasizes the name of Mrs. Fisher. It is boxed off, making her name the very essence of a stamp of approval. This is positioning her as the expert and authority of Southern cooking. This cookbook, rather like the Jell-O cookbook we looked at earlier, could be seen as a form of brand creation, strengthening, and overall brand marketing. And what I mean by that can be found on the following page. So here we have the title page of the book. And I'll show you a close-up in a minute, but it lists her various awards, her accomplishments, why she should be writing a cookbook on Southern cooking. So we can see here that she won 2 medals of excellence at the 1880 San Francisco Mechanics Fair. And this fair was a huge multi-week exposition. It was popular from 1857 to 1899, and it was established to promote the best of local businesses and innovations. Thousands upon thousands of people would attend, including tourists. I cannot just emphasize how big of a deal it was to be included at a fair of this magnitude. And that alone to win 2 medals from your products. And what's also astounding as well is that the Mechanics Institute, they were the ones who organized the fair. Every year, they would produce kind of like an official record of the event, including information about the fair's exhibitors. And of course, who gets a plum shout out? Why, no one else but our very own Abby Fisher. Abby Fisher, Mrs. Abby Fisher, all made by herself. Mrs. Fisher is a colored woman from the South who, by energy and business tact, has built up a large business in the preparation of articles of which she alone has the receipt. Her pickles and sauces have a piquancy and flavor seldom equaled, and once tasted, not soon forgotten. And this, in a sense, is almost like the creation of the legend of Abby Fisher. We have right here the essence of who she wanted to be marketed as, right? This incredible skilled woman from the South who, by sheer force of will and her own ability, forged a successful business. She is positioning herself as an all too American kind of trope of like the self-made individual. This is all here in this very, very brief statement. And again, to this idea that she is the sole owner, the sole proprietor of these recipes, that through buying her preserves, through buying her canned goods, you too can be part of this wonderful kind of legacy of Black women cooking. It's just really an astounding few sentences right here. And again, I just want to emphasize once more just how important this fair was to participate in. I actually found a photograph of a stall from 1880, so the very year when Mrs. Fisher was winning awards. So this photograph here was taken of a stall for a San Francisco framing company. So they would frame things like, like paintings and whatnot. And you can see here that it was a very elaborate stall. It was meant to be eye-catching, maybe a little bit gaudy, maybe a little bit glamorous. It was meant to invite people in and to give a sense of your business. And what I love about this photograph is that it was then turned into an example of letterpress printing. So this was kind of like a trade card, if you will. This photograph was used to promote the business. So it shows that once you exhibited at a fair like this, you had in a sense of reputation. And this was something that you could really lean upon to market your own business with. Okay, so let's leave the fair for a bit and return once more to the world of Mrs. Fisher and her cookbook. And we're now looking at the second page of the book. And again, my apologies, and this is very hard to see here, but we have a notice that Abby Fisher is the copyright holder of her cookbook, and that the cookbook was registered with the Library of Congress. And again, this is rather remarkable. This also situates her as a publisher. So she really is established as the owner of her recipes and the owner of the copyright of the book. This is very, very important. We also see over here a list of who she calls her San Francisco friends, all of whom are like wealthy and very prominent white people. And this is also very interesting because currently there's some very exciting research happening about Abby Fisher's husband, Alexander. And it seems that when they went to San Francisco, he was steadily employed as a porter and as a messenger. And there have been some links to him with some of the men listed here in terms of business pursuits. So it gives a sense of the fact that Abby and her husband, Alexander, were really networking. They were forging social connections to benefit their business. And that is really quite remarkable. And above, we have a preface and apology. And it's very common for cookbooks written by female authors, indeed dating back to the 18th century in England, for this type of content to be included. Women would often have to feign humility as an excuse to write a cookbook. They would have to basically make statements that their friends wanted them to kind of share their knowledge with them, or that they had a noble mission to share their expertise to make the lives of fellow women easier. And we see something similar happening with Abby Fisher's note. She says here that she's been frequently asked by her lady friends and patrons and by ladies of Sacramento during the state fair to share her recipes. So again, this is really in keeping with the tradition of female cookbook authorship, this idea that you have to explain why you're writing your book. And that's all about making connections with other women. And she also too makes some statements about how she sought to write clear, concise recipes that even a child could follow. So we get a sense of the editorial mission of this, and get a sense too as to who she thought her audience was. She really wanted to write a recipe book that would be suitable for the entire family. And this brief paragraph is also crucial too, because when scholars were trying to frame the scope of her life, this is the initial source. This was all people had to go on. And from this simple paragraph, we know quite a bit about her. She talks about her cooking skills. She mentions her husband and states that she cannot read or write. Therefore, her recipes are transcribed by people she knows in San Francisco, people who are probably not familiar with Southern cuisine and not used to hearing what was likely a deep Southern accent. And in fact, there are several examples of recipe titles being lost in transcription throughout the cookbook. Here are two prominent examples. Have any of you ever heard, say, of something called a corolla? It's a sweet dish. It involves sugar and eggs, some flour, everything lightly beaten, and then fried in fat. This is essentially a form of donut, the corolla, right? But to their ears, they heard it as a corolla. But then we have an exceptionally charming example of like misinterpretation. And that has to do with a recipe for something called circuit hash. Now, circuit hash involves tomatoes and butter beans and corn. And as one reads the recipe, if they're familiar at all with Southern cooking, you're like, wait a sec, circuit hash is succotash. And then you have that aha moment of basically based on Abby Fisher having, a Southern accent, an accent from South Carolina, how she is saying succotash is being interpreted by these like San Francisco transcribers as circuit hash. And today we may think that circuit hash sounds kind of ridiculous, but it does make sense in the context of the times, with hash being something kind of quick and convenient, like casual cuisine that you can make. And circuit referring possibly to like judges and lawyers who were on the circuit, who would go from town to town, serving on trials and juries and all that. So they could have thought that this was some sort of, say, fast food that could be made for people on the go. So it kind of makes sense to have circuit hash for succotash. But this then leads us to this idea of recipes as autobiography. And the first recipe in this book is for something called Maryland beet biscuits, a Southern plantation dish. This is an interesting choice to launch as the first recipe, as it wasn't something that could be made easily or just for fun. Making the biscuits was a hard and time-consuming activity, as the dough had to be beaten against a hard surface for at least 30 minutes, so the biscuits would have the proper consistency after baking. Maryland beet biscuits are an example of the culinary labor assigned to enslaved women. So by starting with this recipe, I feel as though Abby Fisher is making the point that this book is meant to be representative of the work and the skill of, her enslaved forebears. Likewise, the very last recipe in the book is something called pap for an infant diet. Mrs. Fisher, through this recipe, tells us that she has given birth to 11 children and raised them all and nursed them with this diet. She also mentions that this recipe is a Southern plantation preparation. Pap was essentially homemade formula. In the United States, enslaved women relied on it to nourish their children. And from this recipe, one wonders if Abby Fisher was forced to act as a wet nurse, or if she fed her children pap based on her family tradition. We just don't know, it's not clear. But we also have recipes that showcase or give, while we get these glimpses of Abby Fisher's knowledge of plantation life, we also have recipes that celebrate her achievements. Here she reveals her famous and award-winning method for pickling. And it's actually a really fun recipe to read because she's like, you can pickle anything. Just follow these simple steps and you will make, you have things pickled in the Fisher way. So it's a very kind of like fun and very good recipe to read. But we also have so many recipes within this cookbook that document and showcase Black foodways. We have recipes for gumbos, recipes that feature okra, recipes for things like chow chow or Creole chow chow. So there's several recipes that are described as being Creole in nature. And we also, of course, have recipes utilizing the best of sweet potatoes. And this here is that if I had the opportunity to recreate one recipe from Abby Fisher's book, it would be this one here, her sweet potato pie recipe. It sounds so simple and so delicious. And her secret is that she adds, the juice of one orange to give it extra like zest. So if I ever do try out this recipe, I would definitely let you know. If anyone in the audience has actually recreated this, I would love to hear about your experiences. So here we have a cookbook written by an award-winning cook and a successful business owner. So one should, of course, only expect a really great advertising campaign. And we find this through the newspapers. We see so many promotional blurbs. And rather interestingly, many of the blurbs that I managed to find through resources like newspapers.com were from the San Francisco Examiner. And this little fact blew my mind. When the San Francisco Examiner was originally formed, it was pro-Confederacy and pro-slavery. After the assassination of President Lincoln, apparently there was a mob and their printing offices were destroyed, and the newspaper was eventually relaunched later. So it had different ownership and a different perspective at the time when Mrs. Fisher was using it to promote her cookbook. But here we have an ad from September of 1881. And I really love this because it's called A Southern Cookery Book on All Types of Things by Mrs. Abby Fisher, late of Alabama. And this is where we find out how much the cookbook costs. It costs $1.50. But this also has another really crucial piece of information about her. We know that her business was located at 202 DuPont Street. And during this time in San Francisco in the 1880s, this was really at the heart of commercial life in San Francisco. So she had a very desirable address to sell not just her cookbook, but her canned goods. I also love that, much like what we saw in the introduction to the cookbook, they really are positioning this as something that would benefit a family. So the very last line in this blurb is that every family should have it. We also see another really great advertisement, also from 1881, where we are told that her cookbook is selling like hotcakes, which I just love. I love that expression. And we also too find out that in addition to buying the cookbook at her store, you can buy it also at the 1881 Mechanics Fair. And then lastly, the last advertisement I want to show you was actually the very first one that I could find, the earliest one from July 11th, 1881. And this also provides a lot of important biographical information. So this is initially advertised as an excellent cookery book. We're then told that Mrs. Abby Fisher, a colored cook from the South, and raised in the family of the late Newton St. John of Alabama. So here we have a new piece of information about her biography. that somehow she was connected to this family, but I'm not too sure what this connection meant. Just as an aside, Newton St. John was a banker. He was later deemed an enemy of the Confederate States because he was against the Confederacy. He was against the succeeding from the Union, and he and his family had to leave the South, to save their lives, and they set up shop in New York City. But it's really unclear what her relationship is with this family. But we then see again that this cookbook, it's calculated to make a family happy. So again, going back to recipes as a form of nourishment, to feed and make happy one's family. Then every family ought to have one. It is simple and plain and easy to be understood. And then we're told where it can be had. And then we get into this language of uplift. This book reflects credit upon Mrs. Fisher, the publisher. So again, she's named as the publisher, and shows what our Southern colored people can and will do. All housekeepers from every part of the country should have a copy of this book. So again, it's this idea that so many Americans were cut off from their full potential. Now is the time to give them credit, to give them space to succeed. Like, look at everything Mrs. Fisher can accomplish. Other people should be able to have the opportunities to do things as well. So clearly there was a lot of intent baked, if you will, into the creation of this cookbook. And I believe that intent may have also influenced the selection of a printer. As we saw in the promotional blurb, Abby Fisher is the publisher of her book. She was in control. So she chose to have her book printed by the Women's Cooperative Printing Union, a women-owned printing business with a majority of female staff operating the presses and laying the type. So the boom in printing after the Civil War created tons of opportunities for women in all aspects of printing. And the WCPU was founded in 1868. And it was through the leadership of Mrs. Lizzie G. Richmond that the operation became a success. And they specialized in what was called jobbing printing. This was small scale printing, normally done on a letterpress. So these things printed on small pieces of paper, such as advertisements and invitations. Though they also printed things like books, administrative reports, and legal work. But they were well known for their elegance in printing, as well as for being strong advocates of promoting women in printing. So you kind of wonder if it was important to Mrs. Fisher to align her business with another woman-owned and woman-operated business. She made a big deal. There was a lot of kind of talk about how she created this business on her own, but how she was the authority of, these recipes, and that she wanted to create this cookbook. So in a sense, it does make sense that she would seek out another woman-owned business to publish her work. And I love this advertisement here because it shows kind of the standards that they created in printing. It shows the elegance of their form, and it shows a different variety of type that they had. It's a very lovely advertisement, and also to kind of list all the different types of printing that they do. But despite their success, the WCPU wasn't without controversy, especially from other women-founded presses. And this is really wild. This was a little blurb I found from a newspaper from 1869. So apparently there was this woman-owned paper called El Dorado. The content was all written by women, and they also printed their own newspaper. And they did not like the Women's Cooperative Printing Union at all, because they thought the printing they were doing wasn't real printing, because they were doing printing on a small scale via letterpresses. And also too, this is how they try to undermine their work. Oh my goodness, it's so terrible. They basically said that, oh, these girls aren't very talented. They're just very pretty girls engaged cheaply on job work. So again, it's this very female-based insult. It's not cool at all. However, I think we can say, while we cannot say just how pretty the women of the WCPU were, and we probably shouldn't, because really that doesn't matter at all and has nothing to do with their skill as printers, we can say with confidence that they printed under the guidance of the one and only Abby Fisher a pretty remarkable book. So thank you for listening to some of the historic information regarding this cookbook. I am now thrilled to pass things along to my colleagues from the library's conservation department, Lena Warren and Jennifer Jarvis. Lena and Jennifer are the dynamic duo who used their skills to bring our copy of the book back to life. Okay, take it away.
Thank you, Heidi. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hello to you all. As Heidi mentioned, we are two of the 5-member team of the Department of Conservation and Preservation at the Sheridan Libraries. And Lena and I are going to take turns leading you through various aspects of the treatment of what Mrs. Fisher knows. Lena was in charge of treating what we call the text block, or the combined pages of the book, and I was responsible for treating the binding or the covers. Quickly, before we talk about the treatment, I want to briefly introduce you to our department for anyone in the audience who isn't familiar with the field of conservation. Our professional organization, the American Institute for Conservation, defines it as encompassing actions taken toward the long-term preservation of cultural property. Conservation activities include examination, documentation, treatment, and preventive care, supported by research and education. And I mention that just to highlight that what we're talking about today is probably the most engaging part of what we do, the treatment, but we do a lot more than that, both behind the scenes and in a public-facing capacity within the Hopkins community. So the Conservation Lab here at the Sheridan Libraries is one of the oldest continuously operating book conservation labs in the country. It was established in 1978 and has occupied a few different spaces on the Homewood campus. And today we are located in a suite of rooms that you see here in the Brody Learning Commons. And so I'll just go through that real quick. On the top left, you'll see our main lab where all of our benches are. The top right is known as our wet room, where we conduct wet treatments such as washing or stain reduction, stain removal, that kind of thing. The bottom left image is of our photo documentation room, where we photograph all of our treatments, of course, before and after, as you'll see. And then on the right is what we call the dirty room, which always elicits giggles, but is where we take care of the kind of messier aspects of our treatment, like paring leather, woodworking, that kind of thing that can be pretty messy. And now I'm going to hand it over to Lena, who will talk about the condition of the book when it came to the lab and her portion of the treatment.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to give you information in reference to Mrs. Fisher's cookbook and reference to the condition that it was in that I started on. I'm a little nervous, so bear with me. Jen and I got together and we had a meeting on the book itself, the condition of it and who would do what. And once I got the book, I was to take care and treat the text block. The text block was in a very poor condition, this as well, so as the cover. So what I started doing is, once I got the text block itself, I had to disbind it because of the broken thread itself. And then I had to dry clean it because it was smudgy and dirt everywhere. It had doggy ears, was mine to take a corner of a page and bend it. There was many things that I had to do to get it to one condition before I started the next. So my next time around, I started, once I dry cleaned it, I got it prepared for mending, meaning I had to get Japanese tissue, the materials that I had to work with, Japanese tissue, paste, and there were areas of some of the pages that had missing or broken areas. We didn't fill in the missing areas, we just mended the areas that was broken using paste, Japanese tissue, etc. So the next time around, once I completed the mending of the signatures and pages, what I did was prepared all of my signatures for sewing. I guarded the outside of each one of the signature sets. And then I prepped my book to get it prepared for using a sewing frame, tape. I had gotten it to the point where I had to make 2 end sheets, end papers rather, sorry, end papers to put on either side before sewing. Then I had to set up my sewing frame, which I used 2 tapes to sew the book on. I sewed and completed the sewing of the text block, got it prepared for the next stage, which was Jennifer and her case.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Lena. I'm just going to briefly go into a little bit more detail about the materials that Lena was talking about. So for conducting these paper repairs that I went too quickly through, here you can see on the top what Lena has done. I don't know if you can see there, but you should be able to see a very thin tissue laid over the word manor there, and you can see the tissue kind of running down to the bottom there where there's a little tear. And so what is this material that we use that's so important to us? Well, there are different types of plant-based fibers that are made into paper, but the kind that conservators use the most comes from the bark of the mulberry tree, what you see here, specifically what's known as the paper mulberry bush or shrub. The fibers from the paper mulberry are known as kozo fibers, which is a Japanese name, although a number of East Asian countries produce kozo paper, not strictly just Japan. So here you can see the bark from the mulberry tree has been harvested. And then the next step is for those fibers to be soaked and then separated, as you see in the bottom photo here. Soaked in water and then separated after soaking for a period of time. And then the pulp from those fibers is mixed with water, as in most hand paper making, and is formed into sheets. And the result of that, as you see, are just dozens, if not hundreds, of different kozo papers that vary in their weight, thickness, and tone. And half of the battle in executing a good repair, such as Lena did on the text block, is having a wide range of papers to choose from and selecting the best one for each treatment. Want the one that has the right thickness, strength, and transparency or opacity, depending on the situation. And so, as you can see here, this is a selection of our thicker papers that we use for treating the covers. And certain covers, not all covers. We don't always use paper to repair book covers. We can also use leather, cloth, parchment, but in this case, a heavier paper than what Lena used to mend the pages was chosen. And we use primarily acrylic paints that we color match ourselves and mix with water to tone the paper. You can see here various shades of brown, and amongst those were kind of the ones we selected for repairing the cover. So our goal is not a perfect color match necessarily, but something that's sympathetic to the original and not distracting to the eye. And so here you see some details of the final result. You can see that the sample paper was used to go around the edges of the covers where the cloth had worn away, as well as reinforce the spine of the book. And here's a full shot of the book in its current condition following our treatment. And hopefully it is ready to be studied and used by the Hopkins community and beyond for many years to come. So thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Well, thank you, Heidi and Lena and Jennifer, for a fascinating presentation. I would like to open up the Q&A portion of the program. I'm delighted to say we have one question already queued up here from Matt Moss. So I'll read it out loud to you. Matt writes, "I'm so pleasantly surprised to hear that these resources exist. I lead the newly transformed dining program at Johns Hopkins, and we would love to see if there's an opportunity to partner on this type of subject matter and see if there's a way we might be able to bring some of these recipes to life and celebrate the past.
Okay, I am all in. So let's connect and figure out how we can make this happen. Like, that is super exciting. And I will mention that prior to conservation work, our copy was fully digitized, and we are going to be putting it on what's called J Scholarship, which is the university's institutional repository. So you'll be able to see the cookbook in its original state probably by the end of this week. But you can also find the entire cookbook too freely available through things like the Internet Archive. So there are a lot of ways for you to view this book, and we can start to figure out how to make her recipes available throughout campus.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I just would ask that those dining opportunities be made available to staff as well as faculty and students, because I know I would be very interested. There's also a comment we have from Gabrielle Dean, who I think just wants to alert everyone that there will be an exhibition of this book with others opening on February 9th in the Eisenhower Library called Black Foodways, a Culinary Diaspora. Is that correct? Do you want to share more about that? Or maybe that was just an announcement. Fantastic. I do have a few other questions, but as I said, we'll get to as many as we can as time allows. Anyone is welcome to respond to this. Does the Sheridan Libraries have any other 19th century cookbooks written by Black authors?
So unfortunately, we don't. And part of the reason is simply because they're so incredibly rare to find. So it's not from lack of interest. For instance, one cookbook I would love to have, it actually is a cookbook by a freed Black woman named Melinda Russell in 1866. So prior to Mrs. Fisher, in 1866 in Michigan, she printed her very own cookbook. So that's the type of thing that I would love for us to eventually acquire. There were also other 19th century books written primarily by Black men who were in service that aren't necessarily recipe books. They're almost kind of like a servant's guide or like how to be a gentleman's gentleman. They contain a mixture of recipes along with like other tips, like how to treat clothes and things of that nature. So there are a lot of other different avenues that we could explore to enhance our 19th century holdings.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We have another question from Oliver here, who asks, do you know how many copies of this book were printed in their first edition?
Oh my goodness, that's such a great question. And it's one that's really perplexed me. I have no idea. And I'm exceptionally curious too, because the very first copy that was seen in the 20th century at that auction in 1984 was bound in navy blue leather. Our copy, however, is bound in brown cloth. So we know from the evidence then that two different binding styles were available. And this binding was created by the Women's Cooperative Printing Union. But when we look at the advertisements and other promotional details, they don't tell us if there's a cost difference between things that would have been bound in leather versus bound in the brown cloth. So we really have no idea what the number of the print run would have been, but it would have probably been relatively small, maybe a few hundred, in part because of the capacity of what the Women's Cooperative Printing Union could do. They were primarily jobbing printers, and they were using, letter presses for their books. But I would love to know the answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. We have another question here. Did the Women's Cooperative Printing Office print other cookbooks?
Okay, yeah, so there's evidence that they printed at least one other, and it was several years after Mrs. Fisher's cookbook. It's a cookbook by a Quaker man, and it's all these like Quaker recipes and life tips. And apparently what also makes this particular cookbook interesting is that in addition to all these recipes, it's chock full of advertisements for local San Francisco businesses. So it's a very important document about kind of the commerce and the business life of San Francisco in the late 1880s. And that again is something that I have on my wish list. I think it'd be cool to have both known books published by this woman-owned press.
Great, great. This one might be one for the conservation staff, the team that we have here. Claire asks, often cookbooks that are well used have lots of stains and such on them. Could you tell if this cookbook was actually used by a home cook or if it was pretty close to its original printing state?
Yeah, so I think it definitely was, we didn't find any evidence that it had been treated in the past. So I think it most likely did come to us, wouldn't you say,
Yes.
Lena, in its kind of original
Original
state.
state, yeah.
And I think, and Lena mentioned this in her remarks, but we did not, we took a very conservative approach to things like stain removal and infills of losses. There's a term called evidentiary damage, and that's really important to us to preserve. So it's essentially damage that is also serves as evidence of use or evidence of the history of the object. And so that is really important to preserve, to help historians and scholars kind of trace the history of a particular object. And so it's not our job to make the book pristine necessarily. It's our job to kind of stabilize it. And because we're a research library rather than a museum, it's also our job to make the book function and it to be used by students and researchers. So, and if we had been in a museum setting, we might have even done less, especially to the binding, and kind of kept it more in the binding part, especially more in its original condition. But because we have that mission to provide access to these materials, we made the decision to go ahead and treat it the way we did.
So interesting. I didn't realize that distinction between a conservator's work from a museum standpoint versus a research library, about it being functional kind of for research. Joanna asks then, well, how long sort of does this process take, to refurbish or, to sustain a book like this?
I don't know how long
Well, it depends. If you work directly with that particular project, it will be faster than if you work with it now today, and tomorrow you have another project that you have to work on and then come back to that. So really, I'd say if someone worked on it directly once they got it, I would say maybe 3 months, even less, maybe 3 to 4 months, even less, because of the cover. Is because Jennifer did a great job on this cover. If you hadn't seen that bad,
Great paper.
but anyway, it would be but like roughly 3 to 5 months.
Wow.
I would say less than that, because if I get on, working with the Texas soft and go from cleaning to sewing, etc., I
Yeah,
could do it pretty fast.
a lot, and each job is different. So some are going to be simpler and take less time, and
some more not.
and some are not.
Yes,
like in this
yes.
case, Lena had to repair basically every spine fold of all of the pages,
Yes,
which takes a long time.
Well, 3 to 5 months. We have a question from Laura, who is asking, is there any evidence of who owned and used this cookbook?
No, unfortunately, there are no names or like handwriting or any type of, say, sign of ownership at all. All we can really say is that it was heavily used And for some reason that we have yet to determine why, some of the pages have these cutouts, and we don't really know what that means. And that's something that maybe a researcher could come into and share more about. But yeah, I would love to know like the history of ownership of this book, because again, it was just, by the time it came to us, it was so battered. But again, it was battered in a sense out of just extreme use in the kitchen.
Wonderful. And so I think we have one final question here. Says, it's amazing to me how so much history was gleaned from this cookbook. Does the history written by your group, researched by your group, accompany it in a display along with the passages, that you shared?
That actually is a really great suggestion. And actually, you just gave me a new project. So yeah, I mean, I think that we could really do a library online exhibition, kind of bringing together all the various elements in terms of the history of the text and the conservation work. And I actually really love this idea, and I need to talk to like Jennifer and Lena to maybe plan this out in the future.
Well, that's fantastic. And I know it's something that the viewers here would love to see. So it looks like that's our last question. I would certainly love to thank Lena and Heidi and Jennifer for this presentation. Thank Claire Miller for joining us this afternoon with her introductions, and all of you, our attendees, for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. A follow-up email will be shared with you that will include a recording of the program and a link to our upcoming event schedule. And we also hope you will join us for our next Lunch with the Libraries, which is February 17th at noon, for a discussion of 3D printing methods and practices in book conservation with Alessandra Scola, our senior book conservator. So you can register for that program at events.jhu.edu. So thank you again, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation. Have a wonderful weekend.